Hello out there. I hope you're all doing good. Today we'll talk about how energy flows in ecosystems, and we'll also elaborate a little bit on what we've already talked about. That matter is recycled in ecosystems. Yes. So we have already talked quite a lot about how plants are producers and produce glucose in photosynthesis, and how consumers then break down that organic matter and get energy out of that, and they do that in the process called respiration. So I just really want to remind you once again that plants do both, because some students tend to think or sometimes forget the plants also do respiration. So both these processes takes place inside a plant. The plant first in photosynthesis, it would produce its own organic matter, and then it would break it down in cellular respiration. So that's important to keep in mind. Yes, and then on to the next slide. As we talked about before, there are many organisms that cannot produce their own organic matter. So animals and fungi and many bacteria, they need to consume the glucose or the organic matter that is produced by the producers, right? And this is a picture that sort of shows actually the transfer of both energy and matter here, right? So we have the producers using the energy from the sunlight, using inorganic molecules such as carbon dioxide and water, and they then produce their own organic molecules. And those organic molecules can then be eaten by first primary consumers, and then those primary consumers can get eaten by secondary consumers, and those can be eaten by tertiary consumers, and so on. For every step, some of the organic matter will be broken down by decomposers, the detritivores, the saprotrophs, and they will break down the organic matter and turn it back into carbon dioxide, water, and nitrate, and ammonia, and phosphate, and other inorganic molecules, right? And even though there's only an arrow from the tertiary consumer down to the decomposers, of course, when the secondary consumers die, they would get decomposed. When the little mouse poop, it would be decomposed. And when the plant material withers, it would also be decomposed. So there should actually be an arrow also from producer and primary consumer and secondary consumer down to the decomposers down here. Yes. So, and when we look at an ecosystem, there are two different models that we can use to sort of show the transfer of energy in those ecosystems, right? So the first type of model is called a food chain. And in this type of model, there's just one path of energy, right? So energy in the form of chemical bonds in the plant can be transferred to the herbivores, to the carnivores, and so forth up the food chain, right? And again, we refer to these as different trophic levels, right? So we have the primary producers, then the primary consumers at the second trophic level, secondary consumers at the third trophic level, tertiary consumers on the fourth trophic level, and so forth. And what the arrows, those arrows down here pointing from one animal to the other, what that shows is the flow of energy, right? The transfer of energy. So this is the transfer of energy from the plant to the herbivore. And what it shows is that the plant gets eaten by the herbivore. The grasshopper gets eaten by the mouse, and so forth. And over here in the other type of model, which is referred to as a food web, we can see that there is not just one path. There are many possible paths that the energy can take, right? So from the grass down here, it's eaten by a rabbit, by a grasshopper, by a deer, and the grasshopper gets eaten by either a mouse or a bird, and so forth. So, and in a food web, it's perhaps more difficult to identify the different trophic levels, and some animals can be on more than one trophic level. But so it's a less simple model, and in science we tend to like simple models. But this is also a more real life model. It's a better model of how energy actually moves in real ecosystems. So we have these two different models that we can use when we want to describe the flow of energy in ecosystems. So in a minute we'll talk more about how energy flows, but what you should know now is that energy flows in and then leaves the ecosystem again. So it enters as sunlight, and it exits again in the form of heat. Matter, on the other hand, stays in the ecosystem and is recycled. And there are these three types of energy that we can find in ecosystem. The sunlight is the type of energy that powers all ecosystems, and then we have chemical energy. That is the energy that we find in all the organic molecules, and also in the molecule called ATP. And then we have energy in the form of heat. And these different types of energies can be converted to other types of energy, right? So if we look at a car first, that doesn't really have anything to do with an ecosystem, but we use it as an example, right? We have the gasoline, we have oxygen, and then we have combustion going on in the engine of the car. And that means that the chemical energy that was in the gasoline molecule is converted into heat energy, so the engine heats up. And it's also converted into kinetic energy, movement of the car, right? And we have some waste products, carbon dioxide and water. And this is not that different from what happens inside the mitochondria of a cell, right? So we have, instead of gasoline, the chemical energy comes in the form of glucose, and we again need oxygen to break down this. And what we get out of this is, again, some energy in the form of heat. This is lost energy. Organisms cannot use that type of energy for anything except keeping, of course, a constant body temperature, but eventually it just leaves the organism. And then it's converted into this other form of chemical energy that is the molecule ATP, which is used for active transport across cell membrane, muscle movement, putting together monomers to form polymers, and all those different processes that takes place inside cells. And again, we have the waste products, carbon dioxide and water. So yeah, to sum up, energy flows and it's not recycled. And energy enters in the form of sunlight and is lost again from the ecosystem in the form of heat. So what happens first is that the light energy is converted into chemical energy, first in the form of glucose, and then later on glucose can be put together, or ATP can be used to build other organic molecules. And chemical energy in glucose is then converted into heat and ATP when the glucose is broken down in cellular respiration. And this can be shown in the form of an energy pyramid, right? So we have energy entering as light energy taken up by the primary producers, and then some of the primary energy stored in the primary producers are transferred to the primary consumers because they eat the plants. So this is actually a food chain, right? Producer to primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer. So some of it gets eaten and is transferred to the next trophic level, but on every trophic level, some of the energy is also lost in the form of heat, and some of the organic matter is broken down by decomposers, and when they then break it down, they also lose some of the energy in form of heat, right? So on every level, some of the energy is lost in the form of heat. And the rule of thumb is that only 10% of the energy is actually transferred to the next trophic level. So even though there's lots and lots of energy in the primary consumers, only some of it is eaten and transferred to the next trophic level. This also means that there is a limit to the length of a food chain. This shows a food chain, right? And you can see that there is less and less and less energy available at the next trophic level. So eventually there's simply not enough energy in the form of organic chemical energy and organic molecules up here to sustain a next trophic level. So that's the reason that we usually don't see food chains much longer than maybe 4 or 5 levels. Yeah. And this is also a drawing of an energy pyramid. It's drawn in a different way and it looks more complicated, but it's actually just the same as we just saw, right? So we have, this is all the energy in the primary producers down here, sunlight entering, chemical energy in the primary producers. Some of that energy is transferred to the herbivores. Some of the energy in the herbivores are transferred to the primary consumers and the secondary consumers up here. On every step, some of the energy is lost because some of the glucose produced in photosynthesis is broken down in the plants themselves in cellular respiration. Some of that is then some of that energy is then still inside the plant in the form of ATP, but some of it is lost in respiration. Again, the same in herbivores. Some of the energy is used in cellular respiration, and only some of it is then available and can be eaten by the consumers on the next trophic level. And on every level, some matter is also lost and decomposed by the detritivores and saprotrophs over here. And they would then also release some energy in the form of heat. So again, only 10% of energy is transferred to the next trophic level. So here's a little task for you, and this is also part of the worksheet that is some of the tasks for today, right? So I'm just want to make sure that you get this, right? So in your book it states only about 10% of the energy in producers is passed to herbivores, and a similar low percentage of energy is passed from herbivores to carnivores. So let's say that the leaves of a tree stores 20,000 joules per meter squared per year of energy. So what you should do here is that you should estimate the amount of energy stored in the caterpillars that feed on the leaves, and then the amount of energy stored in the birds that eat the caterpillars. So step 1 here would be to say, this is all the energy that we have stored in the primary producers. So that's the bottom level of our energy pyramid. And since we know that only 10% of this is passed on to the next level, then the first step in this calculation is to figure out what is 10% of 20,000, because that's the energy that is then the next sort of step in the pyramid. And then, of course, you should do step 2, which is to then calculate how much is then transferred from the caterpillars to the birds. And when you've done this, you should draw an energy pyramid. And it should be a pyramid like this, right? So it should be sort of bars on top of each other, not the triangular version of the pyramid. And when drawing energy pyramids, you should draw to scale. This means that you actually need a ruler to do this accurately.